Fallen Nation, covering the city of Melbourne. I particularly would like to acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and I would also like to acknowledge all elders in the audience and group of panellists today. My name is Lyndall Wisher. I am the Director of the Duldig Studio, Museum and Sculpture Garden, located in Melbourne, Australia. The museum, founded in 2002 by Eva de Jong Duldig, is the former family residence of her parents, the Viennese Australian artists Carl and Slava Duldig. The Duldig collection, which is of national significance, is accessible to the Australian and wider community. On behalf of our organisation, I am pleased to welcome you to this webinar to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the arrival of the Queen Mary in Australia on the 25th of September 1940. I am delighted that our founder and patron, Eva de Jong Duldig, who was on that ship, is with us today and she will be addressing you later. I would also like to acknowledge our support organisations, Monash University Publishing and the Dunera Association. Today's event features 9 speakers, all of whom are either former passengers on the Queen Mary or their direct descendants. I am sure you will be fascinated by what they have to say about the unique experiences of their family within the context of this largely overlooked slice of history. You will also have an opportunity to ask questions, and this will be on the Q&A function on the webinar. I would like to draw your attention now to the image, Laugh and Forget, on your screen. Drawn by engineer Ludwig Meilich in 1941, this poster promoted a concert held in the camp at Tatura. It depicts a Singapore whale bearing the internees onto Australian shores, where angel nurses and laughing soldiers live, a wonderful statement of positivity and resilience. Sadly, Ludwig died in captivity later that year. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our facilitator for our webinar, Dr. Seamus Spark. Dr. Seamus Spark is an adjunct fellow in history at Monash University and a co-author of Dunera Lives, a 2-volume history of the Dunera and Queen Mary internees published by University Publishing. His main research interests are the social history of the Second World War and the history of Papua New Guinea, where he grew up. With colleagues, he is developing a new research project on the art of the Dunera and Queen Mary internees. Seamus will share with you some new information on the Queen Mary story.
Well, thank you, Lyndall. Thank you very much. When asked to be part of this event, I was delighted to accept. Over the last few years, Eva, Stefan, Melinda, Lyndall, and all at the Duldig Studio have become scholarly partners and good friends to me and my colleagues. Happily, they have shared art and information, hospitality and friendship, a true scholarly exchange. And through them, I have made other Queen Mary friends, including Janet Arndt, Ruth Simon, and Loretta Forsey. It's a community I'm proud to have joined in some small way. Another reason I accepted the invitation to speak today was because of my admiration for Eva and the wonderful achievement that is the Duldig Studio. So thank you, Eva and all, for the invitation to participate. I've been asked to speak briefly about the Cinesound newsreel that you just saw before I move to my talk. When I first watched this footage and heard the commentary, I was both fascinated and appalled. The commentary illustrates powerfully some of the prejudices of the time, and indeed the prejudices of a country at war. The Cinesound newsreel was screened in September 1940, the starting point of relations between the Queen Mary internees and Australians, many thousands of whom would have seen this newsreel at the local picture house. But what I find most remarkable about this newsreel is it allows us to gauge how that relationship softened, to gauge the great distance Australians travelled to accept the Queen Mary internees. The commentary reminds us of an Australia we might cringe about, but it also gives hints of Australia at its best. In wartime, when benevolence and generosity might least be expected, the Queen Mary internees were taken in, albeit hesitantly, then gradually made welcome. I think of the newsreel in this light as illustrating a triumph, a long and protracted triumph to be sure, but a triumph nonetheless of humanity over prejudice. What might we learn from this example, I wonder? I came to the story of the Queen Mary internees through the story of the Tatura internees. Sometimes, as many of you know, the two stories are told in parallel, though too often the Queen Mary can seem the poor cousin of the Tatura. I have an uncomfortable feeling that my colleagues and I have been guilty of this ourselves. I suspect that this bias towards the Tatura is mostly a matter of numbers. There were 266 deportees on the Queen Mary. My friend and colleague Carol Bunyan tells me 45 were Italian and 221 were from other parts of Europe, Germany and Austria mainly. By contrast, there were about 2,000 Tatura boys. But numbers are no reason to afford the Queen Mary story less scholarly attention. More of these histories need to be told. And in this vein, today, I'll talk briefly about a remarkable archival file that tells us something new about the Queen Mary internees. A few years ago, I was at the National Archives in London, looking up files on the Tatura and Queen Mary internees. I stumbled across a file, CO 323/1799/1, that I thought remarkable for what it reveals about the decision to intern the men, women, and children later deported to Australia on the Queen Mary. I think this file alters some of what we know or thought we knew about the arrest and internment of German and Austrian nationals on British territory. The file revolves around correspondence between Government House, Singapore, and the Colonial Office in London. The two main figures involved were the Colonial Secretary of the Straits Settlements, Stanley Jones, and the Right Honourable Lord Lloyd, Secretary of State for the Colonies. Government House in Singapore sought to justify to Lloyd its reasons for arresting and then deporting German and Austrian Jews, among them refugees, to Australia. Initially, the idea was for those arrested to go to Ceylon, but Ceylon was unwilling to take them. Why Australia then? Government House explained that Singapore was no place to intern Europeans, the climate wasn't suitable, and that Europeans should not be interned near an Asian population. This reasoning hardly explained the original idea to send the internees to Ceylon. Jones wrote, and I quote, "At the time of the invasion of Norway, the public became somewhat hysterically aware of this danger, and a strong agitation followed for the internment of the German refugees. It took such a menacing form that it was represented to me by a Jew that internment might be considered a kindly act as securing them from the hostile behaviour which was becoming increasingly common." What came next is, I think, fascinating. Jones informed Lloyd that the Singapore refugees had been told, before they were interned, that if they wished to proceed to a country outside the British Empire, they were free to go. He then mentioned the possibility of Singapore being invaded by Japan, suggesting that the decision to intern these men and women was not based purely on their German and Austrian heritage and the war in Europe. It is worth remembering that Jones was writing more than a year before the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the start of the Pacific War. Jones finished his letter thus, "And I must repeat that although the majority of those who have been interned threaten no injury to the country, it is an indisputable fact that their continued presence at large would have ensured for them great unhappiness and excited a controversy which would have been a serious embarrassment to the government." There were two issues here. The first was the decision to arrest and intern enemy aliens. The second was the decision to deport them to Australia. Not all in the Colonial Office were satisfied with Jones's justifications, and especially the reasons he gave for their arrest. It seems that the decision to arrest German and Austrian nationals in the Straits Settlements was made without seeking approval from London, and that Colonial Office officials believed that the Singapore administration did not fully grasp just how drastic its actions had been in arresting the anti-Nazis, anti-Nazis being the language of the file. The file certainly makes clear that the decision to intern the anti-Nazis and ship them to Australia caused considerable consternation in the Colonial Office and continued to do so after the Queen Mary had sailed. As one official commented in mid-September 1940, the transfer of all the refugees from Malaya for internment in Australia, especially considering that these persons have remained uninterned until very recently, is certainly not in accordance with the spirit and tendency of United Kingdom policy at present, and there is little doubt that we shall receive considerable criticism when the facts become known. The official continued, "The transfer of these people for internment in Australia will, however, probably preclude any possibility of their release for the duration of the war. This is by no means in accordance with the intention of the original policy of general internment, which emphasised that this measure was a special measure taken as a matter of urgency and that it was intended that it should be relaxed if circumstances permitted. While therefore it is not difficult to defend the internment of refugees, at any rate in the Straits settlements at present, the natural argument is that they could surely be interned in some other part of Malaya, pending the possibility of their release, should circumstances permit." Another official, writing on 19th of September 1940, went further. "One cannot but sympathise with these enemy aliens, some of whom are German Jew refugees who have escaped from the Nazi regime, and for whom it has been our policy in the past to facilitate settlement, so far as circumstances might permit, in the colonial empire. We are certain to have protests when it becomes known that such people are being shipped off to Australia against their will." As it was, Lord Lloyd, in the Colonial Office, following the advice of his officials, authorised the Governor of Singapore to act as he saw fit, though the approval was given hesitantly. Certainly, the Colonial Office regarded the internment of the refugees in Singapore as an unfortunate episode. Some officials were uneasy about the decision to intern the refugees at all, and most were uncomfortable about the manner in which it was done. But these expressions of morality counted for nothing, for the deportation of the internees proceeded. Illiberalism held sway, and as a result, 266 men, women and children were spared the Japanese invasion of Singapore. That twist of fate saved them from much worse fates than internment in Tatura. The ironies of history are many. Thank you very much. And I now turn to the other speakers. I ask each of them to keep to their allotted time. We want to get to every participant, so I will jump in when your time is up. I've much to his displeasure, I've borrowed a stopwatch from my 2-year-old son, so I ask you not to make me use it. It's my pleasure now to introduce Professor George Fink. George is a professorial research fellow at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health and honorary professor, University of Melbourne. Born in Czechoslovakia, his father Hans Funk was a chemist and his mother Therese was a trained beautician in Vienna. George was born there in 1936 and was 3 years and 10 months when interned at Tatura. George and his wife Anne have 2 children and 7 grandchildren. George.
Thank you very much, Hamish. So if we could have the first slide, please, which is simply a timeline of when we left Vienna in 1939 by Trieste and by way of the SS Conte Rosso, which was plying trade between Europe and Shanghai via Singapore. Next slide, please. Shows Vienna in my family around about the 20s when life was a lot happier. To the right is my grandfather, Emanuel Weiss, or Mano as he was called fondly with the family. Next to him, of course, is his wife, Malvina, who had 9 siblings. And then my mother, Teresa, not yet married. And next to her is her brother, Fritz. Fritz was a graduate or a student in philosophy at the University of Vienna. And unfortunately, sustained severe brain injuries as a consequence of the 1929 anti-Semitic riots, which occurred in Vienna, and particularly in the University of Vienna. Now, going back to Emanuel Weiss, Mano Weiss, he was an entrepreneur, great entrepreneur. He established a major perfumery industry. In fact, it was called Perfumery Weiss, and he attracted with him many of the siblings of my grandmother, Malvina Weiss. They were the Engel family, so it became a Weiss-Engel consortium. So to move on from there, next slide, please, shows some of the documents that relate at least to me. I have to say that after, and a bit like Seamus pointed out, I felt an alien when, even after we'd been released from Tatura. And I'm not sure why that was, whether it was mainly because I was speaking German, entirely German at home, and whether therefore I had a large German or very distinct German accent, or whether at the same time there was a lot of anti-Semitism at the time, particularly in the area that I worked in, which was, or lived in, the St. Kilda State School in Brighton Road. But it wasn't until I actually obtained these documents long after that that I realized that in fact I was an enemy alien. And it always amuses me that at the age of 3 years and 10 months, I was regarded to be a danger to the state or to the country of Australia. The form down below is the discharge form from Tatura, and I don't think you'll be able to see it, but in fact it states that I was released and my family was released from Tatura in 1942, in August 1942, and written in red it says, however, released only on parole. So far the parole has not yet been lifted. So I gather I'm the longest parolist, or might be one of the longest parolists, as far as I know, in Australia. Next slide, please, shows another document, and this relates to my mother and is one that I particularly find, well, to put it mildly, simply ugly, because here was a woman, young woman, who had done absolutely nothing, and she had fingerprints taken. She was treated as a criminal, and this always made me somewhat angry. Now, to switch to something more positive, Eva's father, Karl Dorlick, famous as a sculptor and painter, played a major role in the camp in getting people to paint and make and construct different useful tools, etc. And indeed, my grandfather, Emmanuel, who was with us, was very good. We couldn't buy any toys. He was able to make cars for me out of tin toys made from tins of tobacco and so on. But the construction that I value most is in fact a Torah. Next slide, please. Shows simply a cigar box which kept the Torah. The Torah is, for those that don't know, you don't need to know, the holy scrolls of the law in Judaism. That is to say, it comprises the 5 books of Moses. Next slide, please. Shows the actual Torah inside the box. As always, it's covered completely. And there is a breastplate. That's a standard breastplate that my grandfather fashioned out of some tin or other. Is amazing to me. And also a pointer that you can see here, which is also typical of the Torah. Now, of course, my grandfather couldn't possibly fit the 5 books of Moses in such a small space, and he wouldn't have had the time or the ability probably to do so, but he did put quite a few Hebrew words, few stanzas that were of value in there. And the next slide, please, shows some of those, and of particular importance is the last stanza, which in Hebrew reads, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, which is in English, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And the importance of that is, it is the most important verse in the Torah. It is the fundamental tenet of Judaism. That's to say, the Abrahamic religion, one God only. Okay, so let's move on from that to quite a few years. We've forgotten about Tatura, or virtually forgotten about Tatura now, and you see my parents in a much better state than they would have been in those days in Tatura. With my father on the right, he was quite very capable, established his own chemical industry in Australia, cosmetics, and my mother established a complementary business, retail business, in the form of the Paris Perfumery in the Royal Arcade. So with respect to my own life, next slide please, I was very fortunate to meet up with and to persuade to marry me Anne Elizabeth Fink. Her name was Anne Elizabeth Langson. Here we are enjoying a drink, as is often the case, at one of our favorite places, the American colony in Jerusalem, in fact. And Anne is probably my most ardent, not probably, definitely my most ardent critic, and therefore best friend, because she helps me in many different ways. Now, in terms of my own career, I'm not going to spend much time on that. Next slide, please. My father wanted me to go into chemistry with him, but as young as from the age of about 8 or 9, I was determined to do medicine, and in fact got into medicine at Melbourne University in those days, completed my medical degree, did clinical work, and as a consequence of an unexpected award, scholarship, I ended up at Oxford, and that catapulted me from being a clinician into a clinician that also did research, and my research is focused on what's called neuroendocrinology, which is the way the brain controls hormones, and hormones control the brain. So to move on from that, next slide, please. This I found a particularly satisfying photograph. It's a photograph of my son on the right, Jerome, and grandson on the left, Sharon, his son obviously, and the two of them are tending to a massive headstone. And that headstone is the headstone of the grave of my paternal grandfather, whose name was Solomon Funk. He was the chief rabbi of Vienna, the chief rabbi of Austria, advisor to Kaiser Franz Joseph, and renowned for publishing numerous books on mainly the Talmud, but also on a number of other issues. He was a stalwart, absolutely stalwart Zionist, and in 1921 he wrote a book that was quite influential.
That's 10 minutes still.
I'm just about finished. Come from Zion, the fight for Zion, and I'm sure he would have been very pleased to meet these two chaps who've played their role in Israel's defense. Finally, just to go back to last slide, please, to Tatura. All I was going to say here is life for the parents was very difficult for the reasons that Shamish has already explained, but we kids enjoyed ourselves enormously, and particularly on this day when we were given a huge dollop of vitamin C by way of oranges. It's the Orange Day, and you'll see that Eva Duldig at the front here with the orange and I'm around there somewhere, it doesn't matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George. I was struck by the likeness to your father, how much you look like your father, I thought. Thank you, George. Our next speaker is Jane Joss, whom I'm delighted to introduce. Jane is the Museum Director and CEO of the Jewish Holocaust Centre in Melbourne. Jane's mother, Edith Grunbaum, arrived in Australia on the Queen Mary when she was 1 year old. Jane's grandparents, Ludwig and Tilly Grunbaum, left Vienna in 1938 and established themselves in Singapore. While there, Ludwig worked as an import merchant and company manager. After release from internment, he never fully adjusted to life in Australia and died within a few years, while Tilly worked hard as an embroiderer and remarried in the 1960s. Their daughter, Edith, married Henry Grossbard, a pharmacist whose family had fled Vienna as a baby, and they had 2 children, Michael and Jane. Jane.
Thank you. Thank you, and thanks everyone who's put this event together, even under these unusual conditions, and for allowing me to say a few words. If you'd go to the first slide. Thank you. My mother, Edith Sklarski, was born in Singapore in March 1939 to Tilly and Ludwig Grunbaum, who were on the run from Germany. They left Tilly's mother, Emma, behind in Kassel, Germany. She was a widower whose 2 other daughters had already married and left Germany, one to the United States and the other to Palestine. Emma sent her children off with her blessing and one request: please organise papers for me as soon as possible. In 1939, Ludwig actually wrote to the family in Palestine inquiring why they weren't helping, saying that that the family would give up food if that would help support her financially, if that was the issue. Second slide. My mother, Edith, had a Malay nanny. Her parents worked hard and they struggled with the tropics. It's hard to imagine, other than thinking of our trips to Asia and how challenging the weather is. I know that Tilly wanted to open the windows because of the heat, but when she did, the bats flew in, so she promptly closed them. I just want to read my mother's description of this time. She said, when I was a baby, air conditioning had not yet been invented, so you can imagine it was very hot there. We lived near the jungle, and every Sunday we would go to the edge of the jungle to feed bananas and peanuts to the monkeys. The monkeys seemed to know it was Sunday, so they would wait for all the people to come and feed them. When I lived in Singapore, there were 4 main languages spoken there: Malay, Chinese, English, and Indonesian. When my parents went to work, I had a nanny to look after me. My nanny liked to cook for me, but she wasn't used to cooking in a kitchen. She dug a hole in the backyard and filled it with wooden coals and made a fire. Then she mixed vegetables and rice and rolled them into a big banana leaf to make a parcel. She put this into the coals of the fire to cook the rice and vegetables. When they were cooked, she took them out of the fire and opened the banana leaf on the grass. We sat on the grass and ate the food with our hands. When my parents came home, my mother cooked dinner and was disappointed that I wasn't hungry anymore to eat the dinner which she cooked. Of course, I'd already eaten. My nanny used to speak to me in Malay and my parents spoke to me in German. So by the time I was 1 year old, I could understand 2 languages. And that is also a picture of the house they lived in at 279 River Valley Road, which no longer exists. I looked it up on Google Earth, but the house next to them actually still does. So if we go to the next slide, this piece of paper shocks me every time I see it. A notice to wind up your affairs must have come as a complete shock to Tilly and Ludwig, whose lives and fate were so precarious at that time. Their lives had been totally disrupted. Nazi Germany in 1938, 1939 in Singapore, and then 1940 to an unknown destination. Arriving and being placed in Australia under guard, from displaced people to now enemy aliens, and then arrival in Tatura. This photo shows the children in Tatura. To my mum, Tatura was her creche, her kindergarten, and beloved Lola Jackson, her carer. She has no memories other than eating carrots, so many that she turned orange. I can't imagine how hard it was for Tilly and Ludwig. Censorship meant they were cut off from home. Not knowing what was happening to their loved ones must have been devastating, let alone coping with the Australian weather conditions. So next slide shows Ludwig, who was kept busy picking potatoes in place of the local farmers who were off fighting. And then when the offer came to join the Home Army, he signed up as a cook, which my mum said was ridiculous, as he'd never cooked before. Apparently, he'd made up his mind that this was a way that you would never starve. So with Ludwig now in the Australian Army, my mum and my grandma Tilly could be released and moved to St Kilda. So the next slide shows them. My mother's release from internment notes that her conduct had been satisfactory. Presumably that was code for toilet trained successfully. Then they did what all refugees did, worked hard and did their best to settle in. When they got news from home at the end of the war, it was not good. All their family, who could not leave, had been murdered. This includes Oma Emma, who had been transported as a slave labourer to Riga, Latvia, where she was murdered. By the end of the 1950s, Ludwig had passed away, succumbing to tuberculosis. So next slide shows the 1960s, with my mum and grandma settling into Australian life. They both married, and mum and dad, Henry, soon had the suburban dream happening. 2 kids, Michael and I, and a Hills hoist. It's what every family dreamed of. Michael and I grew up with the idea that our parents were the lucky ones who'd fled Nazism, never really dwelling on those family members who did not survive. So the next slide shows our growing family. This is the family today. I have 3 brothers. My mother remarried, Mark Sklarski, and I have 2 beautiful girls. I guess this whole Singapore Tatura story made me interested in history and unusual stories. I've always been interested in refugees, displacement, being out of place, justice and injustice. And I guess that propelled me to study history, do my master's and begin a journey that led me to the Jewish Holocaust Centre. I've been curator at the Jewish Holocaust Centre for 18 years and now I'm the museum director, leading the organisation through change and redevelopment. I work with Holocaust survivors, and this has given me greater insight into the absent part of all of our histories, those that were left behind, those that we could not get papers for. Last year, I went to Riga, Latvia, and I found my great-grandmother's name on a wall in the Ghetto Museum, and I lit a candle and recited Kaddish for her in the place where she died. This had never been done by anyone in the family. I want to use my mother's good fortune in surviving to help others less fortunate, to help people tell important stories about history, to enlighten people by sharing these narratives. I'm privileged, fortunate and honoured to do this work. Was it inspired by my mother's peculiar history? Who knows? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Incredibly moving stories and the photos were wonderful, the images, so thank you. Our third speaker today is Ruth Simon. Ruth Gottlieb arrived in Sydney when she was 3 with her Austrian parents, Otto and Hannah Gottlieb. Otto, a civil and industrial engineer, had been employed in Malaya for nearly 18 months. The family were in the process of gaining British citizenship, but it did not come through in time to prevent their internment. Her brother Ronnie was born in an army hospital in Tatura. In Australia, her father worked for Hume Pipes Limited in managerial positions. Ruth.
Hello, Seamus. Hello, everybody else. And thank you, Eva, for making this day available. It's been very moving so far and I've learned a lot. I'm going to start my story of the Queen Mary back in 1926, which is, perhaps if I can have the first slide. It's my mother at 18 and my father at 20, and my father was studying at Vienna University. Some years later, this is them sitting on a very cushy wall in a place called San Remo. And the next slide takes us all the way from Austria. No, you've gone too fast. Back to Italy. When my father went from Vienna after he married my mother to Italy, where he had received a position as an industrial engineer at a small artisan chocolate factory, and he worked there until 1938, and when Mussolini's laws asked the Jewish foreigners to be removed, and he went back to Austria. After a short internment in Dachau, he left Austria to go to Malaya, where he didn't know he was going to Malaya. He was on a ship to Shanghai, and in Singapore it stopped, and a representative from a British mining company got on board and asked for an engineer, a cook, a baker, and an accountant. Now, I think Ronnie Fichtdorf's grandfather was the accountant, and my father was the engineer. And he got off in Singapore, but never stayed there. He was straight away sent all over Malaya, working in tin mines at, perhaps the next slide, working on roads and pipelines and all the infrastructure that was necessary for tin mines to sustain them. This really was a workhorse, the elephant, and the next picture shows a bit of the workforce, which was interestingly not Malays. It was mostly Indians and the Hakka Chinese, and a lot of those were women. Perhaps next slide. We were then moved to Singapore, and by a very polite letter asking us to present as enemy aliens and that we would be transferred on the Queen Mary. We went on the Queen Mary and landed in Sydney, as that very interesting slide Seamus showed at the beginning. I don't remember the voyage particularly well. I do remember the train, and I remember not being able to look out of the window. When we got to Tatura, as far as a child was concerned, I didn't have an unpleasant laugh. As George said, we kids had a good time. And I don't think I ever asked my parents, were they frightened or sorry. I was aware there were sadnesses, but I wasn't sure what they were. I was lucky enough to be invited, I think, to the only wedding that took place in Tatura, which was Lotte Cullum, who had been a Singapore resident, and Hans Fischer, who also had been a Singapore resident. And they became very good friends, and we shared a flat with them many years later in St Kilda. This wedding, I don't remember terribly clearly. I do remember it was pretty special. Perhaps the next slide. From the internment camp, a group of the men realised that they could probably leave the camp if they joined the Australian Army. And I think this little group, of which my father is in the white shorts in the middle, and Gerhard Seefeld, as the leader of the camp, was in front of him. That small group became part of, I think, the 8th Employment Company, which I think I'm right in saying became a labour force for the Australian Army. They moved potatoes and unloaded stuff, a lot in Tokemwall on the border area. My father stayed in the army, and I think because of his linguistic skills, he moved around all the prisoner of war camps, translating in Italian and German. And while he was there, he made me a pram, which is perhaps the next picture, which was made.
That's yeah, time, Ruth. So maybe if you could, in the next minute, that'd be great.
All right. Well, pram is now through Seamus's and Eva's good works in the Tatura gallery, and we're not sure who the painter is, but we're all trying to find out. My parents ended up settling in St Kilda and lived there fairly happily. My father went on working for as an industrial and civil engineer, went back to Singapore working and back to Austria, but lived happily in Australia.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and apologies for cutting in.
All right, I'm sorry I'm so long-winded.
Normally as a historian, it's you want long-winded, but I guess not today. Our fourth speaker today, and apologies, Joanna, if I butcher the pronunciation of your surname, never having done French at school, but our fourth speaker today is Joanna Huntley-Comer. Joanna holds British and French nationality and is currently Executive Office Ambassador at the Four Seasons George V in Paris. Paul and Gertrude Schlesinger, passengers on the Queen Mary, are her great-grandparents. In 1937, Gertie was a member of the winning Austrian World Bridge Championship team, and later in Tatura, Paul was deputy leader of the Queen Mary internees. During lockdown furlough, Joanna has been researching her family tree and says, quote, "The more I pieced their history together, the more intriguing the family story became." Joanna lives in Paris with her French husband and 2 teenage children. Joanna.
So thank you, Seamus, for the very nice introduction, and I'm very happy to be here today. And thank you also to Eva de Jong-Duldig for inviting me to contribute today with this family story of the Schlesingers. It's wonderful to see many of those present who've been such a great source of help with my research on the Australian chapter of the lives of my great-grandparents, Gertie and Paul Schlesinger, and my grandmother, Eve Schlesinger. Gertie and Paul were also aboard the Queen Mary when it arrived in Sydney on the 25th of September 1940. They spoke little of their past, and my family had absolutely no idea that they had been interned in Tatura. Today, I am honoured to share a little of their story. The next slide gives a glimpse of their lives in pre-1938 Vienna. The Schlesinger family originated from Vienna, where life had been very different. Paul had worked on the Vienna Stock Exchange, and Gertie owned a private gymnastics school. Gertie and Paul had married in 1922 at the Verein Synagogue in Vienna, which we can see on the left, and which was destroyed during Kristallnacht in November 1938. In the centre, a photo of Eve and Gertie at the beach, and a reminder of more carefree times in the late 1920s. As Seamus mentioned, I had learned that Gertie and Paul were both very keen bridge players, and the photo at the bottom of the right shows Gertie and Paul with friends enjoying a game of bridge. You can see Paul on the left and Gertie on the far right. Just above that photo, a photo of the victorious Austrian ladies bridge team at the 1937 World Championships. Gertie seated at the front in this photo. Bridge was one of the few constants in their lives, and many remember Gertie and Paul through their card playing. Also on that same photo, on the top left, a famous name in the world of bridge, Rixie Marcus. She was author of many books on the subject. I'm referring to this particular photo of the all-Jewish ladies team in her book, A Vulnerable Game. She wrote, "This photo was used on the cover of the advanced brochure of the next European Bridge Championships scheduled in Oslo in 1938. We were looking forward eagerly to defending the title, but our preparations were rudely interrupted, for in March, Austria's most infamous son returned home. The Anschluss put an end to the independent existence of Austria and scattered the Austrian ladies bridge team." On the following slide, I think Stefan Zweig's quote from his book, The World of Yesterday, perfectly captures the mood of Jewish families who were able to leave following the Anschluss, and I'd like to share it with you. "I grew up in Vienna, an international metropolis for 2,000 years, and had to steal away from it like a thief in the night." Moving on to the next slide. Although the Schlesingers held permits for entry to Australia, they actually travelled to Singapore, arriving on the Conte Rosso on Christmas Eve 1938. Helmut Newton was also on the same voyage, and a number of other Tatura internees, and we heard from George earlier, had also travelled from Europe on the Conte Rosso at different times. As George also mentioned, the Conte Rosso was one of the Lloyd Tristino fleet running the Trieste-Bombay-Shanghai route, and many Jews escaping Europe had used this route, as Shanghai was the only city in the world at the time that did not require a visa for entry. Shortly after their arrival, Gertie and Paul appeared in an article in the Straits Times entitled "Bridge Champions Seek Jobs in Singapore." And if we look more closely at that photo, we can see that although they had had to abandon many of their belongings in Austria, they were able to take their treasured bridge trophies with them. The next slide takes us to Singapore in 1940. As we know, World War II broke out in September 1939. And in April 1940, at just 16 years, Eve married Alfred Huntley, who was British, and became my grandfather. He was a Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve officer, and Eve secured British identity through this marriage. Just 5 months later, in September 1940, Paul and Gertie were transferred on the Queen Mary from Singapore to Australia by the British government as enemy aliens. And despite being assured to the contrary, they were interned with the Singapore group behind barbed wire in Tatura. Meanwhile, on the next slide, Eve had remained in Singapore working for the St. John's Ambulance Blood Transfusion Service until Singapore fell in February 1942, whereupon she escaped to Colombo in Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, of course, where my father was born in March 1942. We can see on the next slide that Gertie and Paul were in Tatura at this time. And with hindsight, we might see this as a blessing, as they may not have been able to leave Singapore as easily as Eve with their status as stateless Jewish refugees. Whilst I know little of Gertie's life in the camp, I was able to discover some details concerning Paul. A sketch with the caption, "Happy Birthday to Paul Schlesinger" from his Poker Fellows was gifted to him in Tatura in January 1941. And on closer observation, we can see that this sketch was in fact by Ludwig Mehlich, the very same artist as the Laugh and Forget illustration that was introduced at the beginning of this webinar, and which has been so aptly used as a visual for this 80th anniversary commemoration today. Paul is very easy to recognise on this particular sketch. He is the larger gentleman in the centre, and I believe that the other players would also be quite easy to identify. It would certainly be interesting to know who they were. And I can see there are some signatures on that particular picture that I have not yet been able to decipher, but I hope to be able to do that shortly. Also, highly noteworthy of their time in Tatura was the appeal to Lord Gowrie of March 1941, which was written and co-signed by Leo Duldig, Eva de Jong Duldig's uncle, who was a lawyer, Gerhard Seefeld, the compound camp leader, and my great-grandfather, Paul Schlesinger, who was the compound deputy camp leader. This appeal, which was one of many, exposed the injustice of the internment of the Singapore group as stateless Jewish refugees from Nazi oppression. All three gentlemen represented the interests of the Singapore group and worked relentlessly in the name of justice for them. Insights into the Seefeld family story will also be shared in today's webinar. On to the next slide. Gertie and Paul were released from Tatura on parole at the end of June 1942, and an excerpt from my father's baby book details his third birthday celebration in Melbourne at Gertie and Paul's home in 1945. In the centre, a photo of my father and Eve, and to the right, a page where my grandmother had lovingly noted the names of the young Seefeld and Liebrich guests to this party. I referred to the Seefeld family earlier, and both the Seefeld and the Liebrich families had in fact become friends during their internment in Singapore, in Tatura. To complete this short presentation, I'd like to return to Vienna of today on the next slide. These photos take us full circle back to Vienna, where I visited the Schlesinger family address last year. They lived on the top floor of this apartment building, exactly where the sunlight was shining on the evening that I visited. And to end, one final slide with another Stefan Zweig quote, which I feel captures something of the essence of the lives of those who arrived in Australia on the Queen Mary 80 years ago tomorrow. I have risen and fallen so often that sometimes I feel as if I have lived not just one, but several completely different lives. When I say without thinking my life, I often find myself instinctively wondering which life. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Joanna. That was fascinating. Thank you for, especially for contributing from Paris and for getting up early and being part of this today.
Thank you, Seamus.
I'll say a little later on, I'll say a bit about Gerhard Seefeld, but some of what I'll say there will apply also to Joanna's great-grandfather, Paul Schlesinger. The camp officials tended not to particularly warm to internees with strong opinions, and Seefeld and Schlesinger were certainly in that category. Okay, our fifth speaker today, I'm delighted to welcome Jennifer Huppert. Jennifer is president of the Jewish Community Council of Victoria, a member of the board of the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, and a former member of the Victorian Parliament. Her father, George Huppert, born in Vienna, arrived in Australia when he was 2 with his parents, Eugene and Minna Huppert, from Singapore, where they had been living for only 1 year. Eugene held a doctorate of chemistry from the University of Vienna, and Minna was also a chemist. After the war, he had to requalify as a pharmacist in order to practice. George was also a pharmacist, and the family owned the St Kilda Junction pharmacy for many years. George married Janice Rosengarten, and the couple had 3 children, Stephen, Jennifer, and Robin, and 7 grandchildren. George passed away in 2009. Jennifer.
Thank you, Seamus. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land now known as Glenara, where I am today, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and elders attending this webinar. I'm speaking here this afternoon as a representative of the family of my grandparents, Minna and Eugene Huppert, and father George Huppert of blessed memory, who were passengers on the Queen Mary and were interned in Tatura along with Minna's brother Solomon or Fred Gluck. In particular, my mother, Janice Huppert, siblings Stephen and Robin, and our children and grandchildren, the great-grandchildren of Minna Huppert. And the photo you can see there is George and Minna. 30 years ago, to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the arrival of the Queen Mary, my father wrote an article which appeared in the St Kilda Shore newsletter, in which he described his family's journey from Vienna to Singapore, Tatura and Melbourne, and my comments this afternoon are based on that article. George was born in Vienna, where his parents, both pharmacists, worked together in their own pharmacy. And you can see the photo of that pharmacy behind me today. The Anschluss and Hitler's march into Vienna in March 1938 changed their lives forever. Their pharmacy was forcibly acquired without compensation by a member of the Nazi Party, and they realised their only hope for survival was to leave Austria. However, by this time, the only port that not placed restrictions on Jewish refugees was Shanghai. So they left Vienna by train for the port of Trieste, Italy, for the voyage to Singapore. They were not allowed to take money with them, but the Nazi authorities did allow money to be spent on their passage, so they travelled to Singapore by luxury liner. As well as holding a degree in pharmacy, Eugene had a doctorate in chemistry from Vienna University. When the family arrived in Singapore, Eugene obtained a position as an industrial chemist in a rubber factory, and so the family could leave the ship and settle in Singapore. The family made a life for themselves there, Eugene working in the rubber factory, and Minna, who also had a doctorate in chemistry, studied at the university. She told us that she would have liked to work, but this was not acceptable for a European woman living in Singapore at that time. They also mixed with other refugees, some of whom they knew from Vienna, including the Duldigs, Minna having attended school with Karl. They lived in a house on Orchard Road, which is now the location of a high-rise shopping centre. This slide. In September 1940, as you've heard from previous speakers, they were asked to assemble for deportation to an unknown destination. After 24 hours detention on an island in Singapore Harbour, the family was ferried to the Queen Mary. It was only at this stage that they discovered that their destination was Australia. And the slide you can see, and also the next slide, are some of the documents that were issued to them in relation to their internship. Although the family did not leave Singapore by choice and life in Tatura was not without its difficulties, it was fortunate for them that they did leave. As mentioned by Dr. Spark, their internment meant that they avoided the fate of many who remained in Singapore, detention in Japanese prison camps, including the notorious Changi prison. The next slide. My father used to tell us his early memories included seeing barbed wire and Australian soldiers holding a rifle. sorry, I think my slides are out of order. If we could have the next one, please. Minna had an uncle living in Sydney who was a lawyer, and she contacted him and asked him to try and obtain the family's release from Tatura. The Australian authorities informed him that they were unable to assist, and this is the letter sent to him by the Australian department, informing him that it was not their decision to make, but the decision of the British. In 1942, it was decided the family could be released, and Eugene, along with the other men released from detention, joined the 8th Employment Corps of the Australian Army, and that was the previous photo you saw of Eugene in uniform. Eugene's army service was of short duration. He was able to make a greater contribution to the war effort through his knowledge of chemistry, assisting in the production of power alcohol from molasses at a distillery in Port Melbourne, and the family moved to Melbourne. After the war, Eugene realised that prospects for a pharmacist were better than those of an industrial chemist, and spent 2 years requalifying before establishing the St Kilda Junction Pharmacy. Minna did not requalify as a pharmacist, but joined the business as an assistant. George also studied pharmacy, joining his father in the family business, and he worked until his retirement. Could you please, the next slide, please. This is a photo, as you can see, of Eugene and Minna. Although the Huppert family did not plan to make their lives in Melbourne, we've made home for ourselves, benefiting from and contributing to the Victorian community. Minna and Eugene, like many migrants from Central Europe, enjoyed the vibrant community in Melbourne and were regulars at performances of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra and other artistic events. George and Janice were very involved in communal life, and the next generations have followed their example, influenced by our grandparents' and fathers' experiences as refugees. I've been very privileged to hold leadership roles in both the Jewish and broader communities as a member of the Victorian Parliament and now as President of the Jewish Community Council of Victoria. In what may or may not be a coincidence, I married Bobby Gutman, whose parents also fled Vienna in 1939, although ended up in London, and whose father was interned by the British government, in his case on the Isle of Man. One of the photos on the screen was taken at an event commemorating the 50th anniversary of the arrival of Queen Mary, and is of Minna, George, myself, my sister Robin, and our older son Ben. Final slide, please. And the family continues to grow, as you can see from the next photo of my grandchildren, Joey and Rosie, Eugene and Minna's great-grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I love the photo of your father in uniform. I've often thought those photos of Queen Mary and De Niro, internees, passengers in the iconic slouch hat. I mean, what a wonderful statement of inclusion those images are. Our next speaker today is Rabbi Ronnie Figdor. Rabbi Figdor, OAM, is the CEO of the St Kilda Hebrew congregation. His grandfather, Alfred Figdor, was a bank teller, and his grandmother, Valerie, a chemist. They arrived in Malaya from Vienna in 1939. Their son, Harry, Rabbi Figdor's father, did not join his parents on the Queen Mary and was interned in the Dutch East Indies under the Japanese during the war. Alfred was in charge of the canteen in the internment camp in Tatura. Ronnie.
Thank you very much, Dr. Spark. Seamus, thank you very much. And thank you to the Eva and all the organisers. Seamus, by the way, said to me, oh, you're a rabbi and you've got a microphone, you can have an hour. So I'll make good use of the time. By the way, that wasn't funny. He didn't give me that hour. But on the first slide, you can see a photo of my late grandfather and grandmother. I was not fortunate to know either of them. Both of them passed before I was born. As you can tell from my image, I'm only 21 years old. Interestingly enough, on the next slide, you'll actually see that my grandfather, Albert, who, although was trained as an accountant and bookkeeper, foresaw things already back in 1937, saw the writing on the wall and decided he may have to go overseas, and decided to multi-skill and undertook a course in graphic arts. And already in 1937, there's an image, a painting that he made for the Scouts then. And you can also see a sort of business card of his own company where he was doing graphic arts. Interestingly enough, as Ruth already pointed out, and what would end up saving him, in fact, was back to his accountancy. Back in 1937, having foreseen what would happen, they sent their only child, young Harry Paul Figdor, at the tender age of 15 to Java, where Alfred had a brother, Oscar, and Oscar would look after young Harry, and Harry would finish his high school education. But then a couple of years later, on the next slide, you can see, as Ruth pointed out, that Alfred and Valerie make their way not to Java, but to elsewhere in Malay, in Pahang, I think. And because he was an accountant, he was invited to a tin mine. And I don't know if Ruth has seen this photo before, but that's a photo from 1940 of the tin mine. And Alfred, my grandfather, also did a painting of the area where they lived back in 1940. Whether my grandfather and my father caught up or not at that stage, I don't actually know at this point, but I know that for many years they were not in touch. My grandfather then, and on the next slide you can see there, they joined the Queen Mary, and we've been talking about a ship, but what you've realised is we're talking about stories of people, and people who made worlds of their own, and in some cases, as Jennifer's pointed out, became very prominent Australians subsequently. And here is their refugee papers, similar to the ones that George referred to before. And on the next slide, having arrived into Australia in September of 1940, again, at this stage, I don't know whether they've had any contact with my father for a couple of years, some years. They've arrived, and you can see they're highlighted on the right-hand side in the Prisoner of War Service and Casualty form. Their arrival is marked there on the Queen Mary into Sydney. On the next slide, you'll see some familiar paperwork we've now seen a couple of times upon arrival, and they land up, as you can see, in Tatura. In Tatura, as Dr. Spark has pointed out, my grandfather ran the canteen, but also was quickly recognised for his graphic and artistic form, something, by the way, he did not pass on, thank you very much, to his grandson, although I can do a bit of a good stickman sketch of a smiling face. And there's the front cover of a magazine from Tatura, and you can see there down at the bottom it says A Figdor, and that cover was drawn by my grandfather. Again, at this stage, my grandfather and my father have not been in touch. If you look on the next slide, you'll see my grandfather, like many of the people from Tatura, enlisted. There he is, Alfred Figdor, and his service number. He enlists in 1942. You'll notice that he's discharged fairly quickly. I don't think it was for bad behaviour, but he, like many of the internees from Tatura, last very short time in the Australian Army. But once he leaves, and on the next slide you'll see he in fact joined a factory manufacturing aircraft. They were doing the aircraft production in Fisherman's Bend, and he actually received, amongst many others, a memento of a great production achievement. In fact, you can see at the bottom of the image there, memento of great production achievement, and that was issued to all of the employees back in 1944.
That's your time, Ronnie, so if you could maybe finish.
Okay, so I'll go to the next slide because I should make a quick reference to my father. He, in fact, was trying to make contact with his parents, and they to him. They were able to send him correspondence through the Red Cross. Unfortunately, his correspondence to them did not make it through, and they were out of contact for many, many years, and they didn't know of his existence. If we skip to the next slide, and skip to the next slide, and skip to the last slide. Then one more, please. And just to end off by saying, I made a comment that the Queen Mary is not just a ship, but it's a story of people. These people spawned generations. And it's a Talmudic phrase, whoever saves one life saves an entire world. And there you have Alfred Figdor married to Valerie, and coming from them, one son, one daughter-in-law, but 5 grandchildren. You've got 17 great-grandchildren and 21 great-great-grandchildren. Thank you.
Ronnie, thank you very much. Our next speaker today is Janet Arndt. Janet represents the Queen Mary Singapore internees in the Dunera Association. She is a former teacher and now entertainer, and many of us here today have had the pleasure of hearing her sing. Her parents.
Thanks, James. No, Ronnie, I won't do it now, I promise. Okay, first slide, please. Okay, the Queen Mary. We know that the people from Singapore arrived on the Queen Mary. My parents had one short trip before that from Germany to Singapore in December 38. Dad was arrested on the street on Kristallnacht, spent 6 weeks in a camp, a concentration camp when he was released, provided they left the country. He said to my mum, who was his girlfriend, who lived as a boarder in their home, "We have to leave together," and she said, "Only if we're married." And so they found the rabbi because the synagogue wasn't there anymore. And they had a family member who worked for a shipping company. And so from Hamburg to Singapore in a Japanese ship. And so for a year and a half, they were able to live in Singapore. They were met by Helmut Jakobowitz, Helmut Jackson, came on board the ship at Singapore and said, "I've got a job for Court Hart." So Mum and Dad were the only passengers to get off that ship that was bound for Shanghai at that time. So a year and a half, and then they got the note, "You've got to pack your stuff, you've got to leave," which they'd already done back in Germany. They were the last of the family to leave the family house in Köslin, and so they were able to take some things with them. Amazingly enough, a couple of wooden crates with stuff in there, which they even had in Melbourne. All these wooden crates arrived via Singapore to Melbourne, and they were still in Mum and Dad's fernery in Gardenvale Road when Dad passed away. And so I opened up, the top one was used as a toolkit for Dad because he was a monumental mason, and the bottom one actually still contained linen, bed linen and tablecloths from Germany. So when or where or how they ever used that, I have no idea. My mother also said that they brought iron bed heads, for goodness sake, who needs a bed head? What or why, I have no idea. So I have a lot of interesting and funny anecdotes that my dad was able to tell me. I really admired his sense of life and of fun. And he kept my mum going through all the stuff that happened, you know, from Germany, Singapore, Australia. So it was wonderful with his anecdotes. Next slide, please. Right, here we do have the kindergarten group. The lady on the far left is Minna Huppert. The tall lady in the middle with a little child is Ilse Blair, and the blonde lady on her right is my auntie Lolo. Now, why was she called Lolo? Because when she was little, she couldn't say Charlotte. So she was Lolo from a very, very early age, and the Jakobowitzes became Jackson. And so we have little George here in the front, and I think Ruthie in the middle. So some of the children who are speaking today will recognise themselves in that group. So they did have a good time, these kids. Now, when they arrived at the camp, as you know, they arrived on the Queen Mary, and then they were brought to Melbourne, to Tatura. And when they arrived, my mother saw the long buildings, the Nissen huts, as we all know. And my mother said, "Is that where the luggage goes?" They said, "No, that's where you're going to live." So that's where they had to live. They found their accommodation there, and there were bunks, you know, one up, one down. My father saw the bunk up the top. He went and found a saw somewhere, and he sawed off the top bunk and put it down next to the other bunk, and he got carpeted for damaging government property. Now, my father had a couple of other problems. When he joined the army, the 8th Employment Company, we'll talk about that in a minute too, he was carpeted again for swearing. And when he was asked, "Private Aunt, do you know what these words mean? What are these words?" And he said the words, and he said, "No, I don't know what they mean." He said, "Right, dismissed," and off he went. So there are little anecdotes that my father told a lot through their time. Okay, next slide, please. This is a photograph of the bust of Captain Broughton. He was the NCO who looked after the 8th Employment Company, and that is the bust that Carl made. And you can see just behind him, you can see Captain Broughton. The gentleman in the middle with the cap on is Padre Young. Charles Young was the Padre of the Army, and he was a wonderful helper and a person supporter, particularly I know to the Duldig family, helped them a lot when they were released from camp. And the gentleman on the left with the long coat and the hat is my father. And I think probably my father might be in this photograph because I'm told by my father that he loaned some tools to Carl. Now, Dad brought some stonemasonry tools with him on his long trip. The family had been stonemasons in Kirslin for a long time. My great-grandfather was a marble sculptor. So Dad took some tools with him, and that was his life's work in Australia when they were released from camp. He was in the army for 3 years, till 1945. And so when they were released from camp and he eventually found work, that was his life's work in Melbourne. My mother was a stenographer typist. She eventually got work as that. Next slide, please.
That's time, Janet.
Yes,
So
I'm just going to finish. Obviously, Dad was in the army for 3 years. I was born in that time in 1944. Mum was in a house in St Kilda in somebody's room there, and Dad used to help her when he came on leave sewing sequins on material because that's what Mum did for peace work. So a wonderful life at the end. Life was very, very good to them. On their release, I had my first birthday in Albury because that's where he was stationed 3 months till he was discharged. Thank you. Thanks, James.
thank you very much, Janet. Thank you. Our next speaker is Marita Seefeld, or Marty. She is the great-granddaughter of Arthur and Sophie Seefeld, and granddaughter of Gerhard and Rosie, and daughter of Alexander Seefeld. 3 generations of the Seefeld family, comprising 10 people, travelled to Australia on the Queen Mary, and 3 more were born in internment. Her grandfather, Gerhard, was camp leader in Tatura and responsible for the petitions sent to the authorities seeking release from internment. Marty lives in Traralgon and describes herself as the self-appointed keeper of the Seefeld family history. Now, she can't be with us today, but she has contributed family photographs and information, and I've been invited to read her words on her behalf. Marita can trace her family back to 1788. Her ancestor, Wolf Levin Seefeld, lived in Copland, West Prussia. Today, there are descendants of Wolf all around the world. Arthur Seefeld, born 1879, and his wife Sophie lived in Hamburg, where Arthur was a professor of dentistry and the superintendent head physician of dentistry in the General Hospital in Hamburg. They had 4 sons. Their second son, Gerhard Seefeld, arrived in Singapore in 1926 and became an import-export merchant representing British, Canadian and American firms. He and his first wife, who died in childbirth, had 3 children, Fred, Loretta and Doris. Arthur and Sophie's youngest son, Helmut Seefeld, married to Edith, also emigrated to Singapore. In 1938, Gerhard married his second wife, Rosie Frug, a Russian Jewess, and the couple had 2 children, Gerald, 1939, and Valerie, 1940. After Hitler came to power in 1933, Arthur was dismissed from his professorship. In 1939, he, together with his wife and his 2 granddaughters, Loretta and Doris, who had been living with their grandparents, fled from Germany and travelled to Singapore. In September 1940, the 3 generations of the Seefeld family, numbering 10 people, were deported from Singapore and interned as enemy aliens in Tatura. Gerhard, whom Marita describes as strong, proud and opinionated, was elected camp leader of the Queen Mary group, with Paul Schlesinger and Dr. Leo Duldig as his deputies. 2 more children, Alex and Valerie, were born to Gerhard and Rosie in Tatura. Marion, born to Helmut and Edith in 1941, brought the total number of Seefelds in Australia to 13. During 1942, Arthur and Sophie, as well as Helmut and family, were released from internment, but Gerhard and family were not released until 1943. Over time, the Seefelds rebuilt their lives. Arthur eventually returned to dentistry. Gerhard served in the Labour Corps, then in the regular army, and after the war began rebuilding his import-export business. Helmut too spent time in the Labour Corps, and another daughter, Evelyn, was born to him in 1945. Arthur passed away in 1962, Sophie in 1965, Rosie in 1979, and Gerhard in 1989. Edith passed away in 1999 and Helmut in 2008. Valerie passed away in 2004 and Doris in 2014. Marita says, their legacy lives on through their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren. Their stories will continue to be told. We will never forget. And I would like to add a brief note. Eva invited me to add a brief note about the Seefelds. So a brief note here from a historian's perspective. Gerhard Seefeld looms large in files held at the National Archives. For the most part, there was a relatively easy relationship between internees at Tatura and Australian officials, but this was not so in Seefeld's case. Officials didn't trust him, seemingly for no other reason than he was a strong, outspoken, and at times a difficult character. They knew he was anti-Nazi, there was no question about that, but at the same time worried he was anti-British, which in the minds of some short-sighted officials was as bad as being a fascist. In 1941, he was dismissed as camp leader of D Compound. The reasons are complex, but it certainly didn't help that Seefeld and Colonel Tackerberry, Tatura commandant, did not get on. After Seefeld's dismissal, Tackerberry ordered another election, and internees promptly re-elected Seefeld as compound leader, much to Tackerberry's great displeasure. Tackerberry actually interpreted this as a sign of mutiny. That's a very brief note, but it's a really fascinating history and an interesting example of relations between internees and officials. Okay, our last speaker today, our last panelist, is Eva de Jong Duldig. Eva was born in Vienna 1 month before the Anschluss and arrived in Australia when she was 2. Hitting her first tennis balls on the court her father built in Tatura, she became a quarter-finalist at Wimbledon, and after her marriage to Henry de Jong, was champion of the Netherlands. Her award-winning family memoir, Driftwood, Escape and Survival Through Art, was published in 2017. Eva.
Thank you so much, Seamus. I really have to acknowledge your amazing contribution to this webinar. Your new research, which we heard at the start, was just fascinating, and all your perceptive commentary has just been really, really making our whole event. It's raised the profile, it's raised the historical profile of our celebration to another level. Thank you so much. Also, many, many thanks to my Queen Mary family. This project has brought me so much closer to you all. You all went to so much trouble to gather the material presented, and we've been privileged to share a remarkable insight today into your personal family story. Each story is so unique, and every family is so interesting. I really hope we can keep in touch with each other going forward. Our arrival in Australia took place only a few days before the Jewish New Year, which in 1940 fell on the 3rd of October. 80 years later, we have just celebrated Rosh Hashanah, and I would like to wish our Jewish friends Shana Tova, a good year, and well over the fast. On the screen is an image of my mother, Slava Horowitz Duldig, which came from the Australian archives. I can't imagine her feelings when she had to put on a numbered vest, a prisoner's number. The loss of freedom really weighed much more heavily even than that on my father, Karl Duldig. The inscription on the left, as you can see, says Przemysl 1902, and on the right, Tatura 1941. Did he think that was going to be the end of his life? After a year in internment, nobody at the camp knew how long we would still be incarcerated. The mood in the camp was down as all the petitions for release had failed, and news of the war, when it did filter through to the internees, was utterly depressing. At that stage, nobody knew that Singapore was about to fall, and that indeed, as has been already mentioned, we were the most fortunate group alive to get out of there in time. The middle drawing is a little sketch Dad did of me, his impression of his little daughter. Next slide shows two families outside the huts in which we were living. On the right are Miriam, Ilse and Werner Bear. Miriam owned this photo to us, so thank you to Miriam. She's just a tiny bit, little bit younger than I am, and she's watching, I hope, today. And on the left is a photo of me with my mum and dad outside our luxury dwelling in Tatura. You can also see just a slight image of detail of the sculpture that my father carved there with an axe, and it was standing around for all of us to play. And the next slide actually shows you it in raw detail. There it is, my father's drawing, and the children are all of us little tots running around playing Ring-a-Ring-a-Rosie and having a really good time, as George already mentioned, and Ruth and I would agree that all the children really had nothing to worry about. We could wander freely through the camp. We had our parents near us, and we had lots and lots of playmates. But for the parents, it was another story. Every one of my father's drawings in the camp shows the barbed wire. On the right is a carving he did from a fragment, and he called it fragment, a fragment that is a piece of firewood. And that particular sculpture survived, and it is in the Newcastle Gallery, whereas the large sculpture you see in the drawing was chopped up by the next inmates for firewood. Next slide, please. And here we are in Melbourne. We're free. I think we look free. I think we look happy. I always thought my father looked so handsome in his uniform and with his digger's hat, and my mother in her smart Viennese costume, she would have said, and her hat, which she kept wearing till it was absolutely threadbare, making sure that I was always beautifully clad. The sacrifices were great, but in the end, as we all know, we actually have been extraordinarily lucky. And it is that luck which has taken us forward in this country. I am the person who also would like to thank everybody. And if I could go through now to our acknowledgement page, there have been so many people who've been involved to produce this webinar. We did it really so quickly, and I really am absolutely amazed myself at the wonderful, wonderful production that's come out of this. So much more will spin off it. And I was moved, I was nearly crying when I heard and saw some of your wonderful actual, well, performances. They're not, but actual, I mean, what you said today. Through this amazing platform, it's been possible to share today's celebration right around the world. And I think that is another amazing thing. Joanna came in from Paris, and we've had a message from people in Austria and in Israel and others. This event could not have happened without the support of the Duldig Studio. The event is hosted by the Duldig Studio, and on behalf of my Queen Mary family, I would like to thank the board of the Duldig Studio, the director, Lyndall Wisher, and the staff and volunteers, especially Lucy Whitehall, Stefan Damsky, Melinda Mockridge, and Janine Kibble-White for making this possible. I'd also like to recommend to you Monash University Press's publications De Niro Lives 1 and De Niro Lives Profiles. In 2014, the eminent historian, the late Ken Inglis, saw the exhibition Art Behind the Wire at the Dulwich Studio and decided to include the Queen Mary episode in his forthcoming epic book on the Tatura. Thank you also to his co-writers, Bill Gamage, Seamus Spark and Jay Winter, and especially to Carol Bunyan for the comprehensive Queen Mary passenger list included in Volume 2. This remote celebration of the 80th anniversary of the arrival of the Queen Mary in Australia is being recorded, and you can also continue to communicate with the Dulwich Studio online.